There we go. So everyone should be able to hear me just fine. If you can just give me some confirmation in the chat pod that you can see and hear me, that would be great. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's really interesting to have a group dedicated to Adobe AIR. And I thought it would be best to just provide an introduction to AIR, because I think a lot of people, if they haven't sort of gone through all of the twists and turns of the whole Flash and Adobe Runtime's ecosystem over the past 10 years or so, they might be a little intimidated jumping into something like Adobe AIR. And there are so many different resources and frameworks and IDEs and so forth available for Adobe AIR developers that it would really be good to have a nice, solid introduction to the runtime where people would be able to kind of like jump in. And I imagine a number of subsequent meetings are going to expand on many of the topics that I present tonight. So with that, let's move along a little bit here. So myself, my name is Joseph Labrecque. I'm a senior interactive software engineer for the University of Denver, and also the principal and sole proprietor of Fractured Vision Media, LLC. I'm an Apache Flex committer for the Apache Software Foundation, and an author with entities such as lynda.com, LinkedIn Learning, Pluralsight, Peachpit, Adobe Press, and so forth. So I've got a lot of stuff out there. A lot of that stuff does touch upon or even focus on Adobe AIR. So for those who aren't familiar with Adobe AIR, what is Adobe AIR? It's basically a runtime that allows you to either distribute applications based upon a shared runtime, distribute applications with a captive runtime, or even distribute applications that have been compiled through related processes to that runtime to run on something like Apple iOS. So depending upon what platform you're targeting, as you can see here, it definitely has a wide variety of platforms that it can target, including Windows and macOS for desktop. You can even hit Linux if you want for desktop, though you have to go for an older version because newer versions do not target Linux. But Windows and macOS definitely. Also iOS and Android. So, you can target iPads, iPhones, Google Android devices of all types. And you can also target, though I'm not sure if there are any in existence right now, in terms of the current retail market, BlackBerry devices. So that was a big thing a few years ago. And, BlackBerry, they were sort of overtaken quite a bit by iOS and Android, but they still do have a market out there. And AIR, as far as I know, can still target certain of those devices. In addition to these, you've also got sort of derivative devices. So something like Apple TV. Adobe AIR can definitely target Apple TV, and Android's TV. So Google's Android TV, it can target as well. So it's really, really expansive, and there's not a lot you need to do to target these different things. You can use the same code, the same assets, and so forth to target all these different platforms, depending upon what you're trying to do. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the projects that I've used AIR for over the years and what kind of makes AIR interesting to use, what makes it powerful in terms of driving some of these projects. So this first one here has to do with multimedia projection systems. What you're seeing here is the sort of user control panel for a system that taps into a room with various multiple projectors. So it's able to detect how many projectors are in this room, and then it creates a little control panel based upon each projector, and a faculty member at the University of Denver can then go ahead and load up any of their media collections in here and sort of display still images, text slides, audio and video files through these various projectors based on these controls, and the students don't ever see this portion of it. The only thing they see are the little previews that you see there, but in full resolution on the actual projection systems. And this is all made possible through Adobe AIR. Here's another university-related project that I've engineered called CrunchBuddy. And this is actually a headless application. It doesn't have any sort of UI whatsoever. It runs as a Windows service on a Windows server. And it's called CrunchBuddy. And what it does is it taps into and directs resources to an embedded version of FFmpeg through the Adobe AIR Native Process API. The Native Process API allows you to do basic input and output with any sort of process on your native system. So since this is a Windows system, it has its own embedded FFmpeg instance that it can send directives to and receive notices from. So what this allows is it allows faculty to go ahead and upload materials, video materials. It gathers those materials, introspects them, and then passes them over to FFmpeg for transcoding into web-accessible video content. After the transcode is complete, it receives a message back via native process from FFmpeg that allows it to talk to the system and tell the system that it's done. The system will then notify the user that their video is ready. So even though Adobe AIR and anything flashy, is often seen as something very visual, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be visual at all. I mean, I don't even have a screenshot of the actual application here because it doesn't have a UI whatsoever. Then there's something like Telemetry Easy, which is something that I released a while ago when Adobe first released Adobe Scout. So Adobe Scout is a Creative Cloud application that allows you to do some really low-level inspection of telemetry data so that you can really monitor what's going on in your application. And it's specifically targeted towards people using Adobe AIR for Stage 3D to build games and interactives and highly visual things like that. What this application was its purpose is to actually, when you create content using whatever you would do to create that content, whether it's Flash or AIR or whatever, it produces a SWF, and you're able to actually change one of the header parameters in the SWF to enable Adobe Scout to read that extended data through Adobe Scout, right? So for a while, the tooling hadn't quite caught up with that yet. So using something like Flash Builder or Flash Professional, you weren't able to put that data in there properly. So this was a little application. All you needed to do was drag a SWF onto it, and it would rewrite that header properly so that Adobe Scout would be able to inspect and use this that particular piece of content. This is something that's actually fairly recent. The last time I worked on it was in 2016, and this was a project for the Computer History Museum out in California. And it was done for the Adobe Photoshop 25th anniversary in cooperation with Adobe Systems Incorporated. And what this does is it's an AIR application that runs alongside of Photoshop that would allow people to visit the exhibit and take a photograph of themselves against a green screen, remove that green screen, composite the person who's having their photo taken, the user, with a background of their choosing, along with a character of their choosing, or a famous person rather, and then they would be able to export that. And that was all driven with Adobe AIR. And here you can see people actually using the initial setup. This isn't the permanent exhibit for the application, but it's a functional exhibit, and it's people using it on the 25th anniversary. And here's another look at choosing a specific background. It goes through in a number of different steps. They're able to choose a background, pick a partner, and then grab a photo of themselves. And here's an example. This guy here went a little crazy with the number of Obamas that he put into his picture with himself. So you can see it's, I think he did a little extra stuff with the Photoshop rotation tool and so forth in order to get this effect, because the application itself only allows one instance of the famous person. But it was pretty successful, and it's all driven by Adobe AIR. In addition, I like to point out that a lot of Adobe applications were built with AIR, at least the prototypes thereof. So this right here is actually a prototype of what eventually became Edge Animate, and this initial version was built with Adobe AIR. In addition to that, Adobe has a lot of mobile applications that are out right now, and some of them are still built with AIR. A lot of the others are built upon native platforms because they need to be like super performant, and whatever other kind of political decisions go into that. But Adobe's initial foray into both iOS and Android was all AIR based. So all of their applications were built on Adobe AIR. All right. So with Adobe AIR itself, it has a very similar release schedule in line with Flash Player. So that release schedule entails full feature-bearing numbered releases every quarter. So AIR 26 was released. It was the most recent one to be released. And there's actually, I believe, an updated beta of either AIR 26 or Flash Player 26 on the Labs website, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit. But in addition to these feature-bearing major releases, there are also smaller incidental releases that are created and distributed for security and performance purposes. So, if there is some sort of security alert, Adobe is actually really good at patching that stuff very quickly and getting the distributables out there, getting a new SDK out to developers, and so forth. So here are 3 frameworks that support AIR in a very, and these are probably the most used frameworks right now. There are many more. However, we have Starling here, we have Feathers UI, and also Apache Flex. So if you want a good point to kind of jump onto stuff, any of these will work. And Feathers itself actually works in conjunction with Starling. So Feathers UI is a set of UI components and so forth that runs on top of Starling. What makes Starling different from Apache Flex is that Apache Flex uses the traditional display list. So kind of the stuff that you've used if you've done any Flash development in the past however many years, right? So 20, 25 years, however long it's been. And Stage 3D is something that is used by Starling and Feathers, and this is a GPU accelerated display surface. So it's much more performant, especially when it comes to doing things with mobile. So if you're looking at mobile, I'd definitely suggest you have a look at Starling and Feathers. To piggyback upon Starling, the creative Starling, Daniel Spurl, actually released a few weeks ago a large book that gets you going with Starling. So it's called the Starling Handbook. And I don't have a copy myself yet, but from everything I've seen, it's a really, really good resource. And since it's written by the creator of Starling, it's the definitive resource on Starling, really. So if you're interested in doing anything with Stage 3D, anything with mobile AIR, this is probably a resource you're going to want to get your hands on. You'll also want to get your hands on the actual Adobe AIR SDK. And that can be done in a number of different ways. You can download it directly from Adobe. Just Google, Adobe AIR SDK download, and you'll get to a bunch of different packages based on your operating system and so forth, where you can download the thing and integrate it into your environment. Additionally, Apache Flex offers a AIR-based installer, so the installer itself is actually built in AIR, which installs the AIR SDK alongside of the Apache Flex SDK. And that's a really neat little app, a good example of what can be done with AIR as well. In addition to both of these, there are other ways of acquiring the AIR SDK. For instance, if you were to install and update Adobe Animate CC, that team regularly updates Adobe Animate with the latest SDK upon every release. And if you need to update the SDK between releases, there is a built-in mechanism to do that as well. So we mentioned a few of these tools already. So we have Adobe Animate and also Adobe Flash Builder. It used to be called Adobe Flex Builder, but they renamed it just like they renamed Adobe Flash Professional to Adobe Animate. There's been a lot of renaming going on the past few years. You've also got Flash Develop, which is specifically for the Windows platform. You've got Visual Studio Code, which has a really, really nice extension from next-gen ActionScript that allows you to write ActionScript in MXML and output to a variety of different things, kind of in conjunction with some of the work with the Apache Flex community and their compilers. In addition to these, two of the pretty heavy hitters in terms of development environments are IntelliJ IDEA, which has full support for Adobe AIR and Apache Flex and anything to do with that, and also of course FDT, which John mentioned at the beginning of this session here. I'm going to pull over my Creative Cloud desktop app here and just note that there are a number of things that you can use if you do have a Creative Cloud subscription to use with Adobe AIR. There's, of course, Animate CC, which you can find right here. And there are a few other things, too. So, for instance, here's where you find Flash Builder. And also Scout, which I mentioned before. You can use that to do lots of stuff with your AIR applications in terms of monitoring their performance and tweaking things involved in that. And you also have this gaming SDK. Unfortunately, the gaming SDK hasn't been updated in quite a while. It includes things like Starling and Feathers and some other frameworks that you can use with AIR. But honestly, right now, you're probably best to go off and get those on your own because the versions inside the gaming SDK are a bit old. All right, so at this point, I'd like to go through and give a number of different demonstrations, look at a few different links and so forth in terms of resources and places you can go to, really get going with this stuff. So for that, I'm going to pop over to my web browser. But before I do that, let's actually have a look inside of the chat pod here because I see there's some stuff. Yep. So nextgenactionscript.com. That's a great resource. Let me actually bring up my browser here, and I'm going to click on some of these guys. So there's NextGen ActionScript. You can grab stuff for Visual Studio Code here. There's Feathers. Let's grab that. Oh, actually, I already have Feathers in here. That's okay. Oh, yes, that's right. Feathers actually does have an SDK as well. So if we go to the Feathers SDK, you can see that. And that has a very similar installer to what we've seen with Apache Flex. Let me go through some of these because I've got a number of different tabs open here, and we can go through a lot of these resources. So this is basically the adobe.com website. And if you scroll down, you can see down here that we've got links to get Acrobat Reader, Adobe Flash Player, Adobe AIR, and even Adobe Shockwave Player. So, you know, you see people talking about Flash being dead. And it's like, you know, guys, Adobe still distributes Shockwave Player on their main homepage right here. So I think Flash Player still has quite a bit of life left to it. And Adobe AIR certainly does, because it's not constrained to browsers and so forth. So here's the actual download page for Adobe AIR. And this is where you would go to actually download the runtime. So this is what users would grab to use AIR content that does not employ captive runtime. Because as I mentioned before, you can distribute your AIR applications using a captive runtime. And if you do that, then people don't even need to install Adobe AIR. So this is the actual AIR SDK that you can grab from Adobe. You can see here, this version is the AIR SDK and the compiler. And it's version 26, which is the latest version. You'll note if you scroll down here that Flex users, and this is for if you're actually using Flash Builder from Adobe, you can grab the version of the SDK from here that you can use with Flash Builder and Flex. Up here, this is all you need if you want to update your AIR SDK that you're using inside of Adobe Animate. You can just grab one of these and use it through there. If you want to download the latest version of Apache Flex using the Apache Flex installer, you just go to Download Flex here, and really the easiest way to do it is to just use the SDK installer. And there it is. I think because I'm in incognito mode, it's not allowing Flash Player to run here, but that's okay. Usually we'd see a badge here. This is where you get it. There's also Adobe Labs. Now, Adobe Labs is really important if you want to go through and grab the latest beta versions of Adobe AIR. So you can see right here we have Adobe AIR 26 beta, which was released on May 24th. So whenever you want to monitor to see what Adobe is doing in terms of Adobe AIR, you can go to this page here. And if you scroll down, you'll find some release notes that talk about the new features. And I'll open that in a new tab. And you can also go through to the AIR Beta Forum, or you can click on this Community tab here to go to the actual AIR Beta community. And here they'll often release a number of additional pieces of information here. So you can see here, people are talking about the AIR SDK 64-bit for Windows, which is an upcoming thing that people are very, very interested in. There's a number of other things here, but this is where they make their major announcements as well. So here, Chris Campbell, who's the product manager for AIR, he's made an announcement on June 13th about the AIR 26 runtime and SDK. So AIR 26 is pretty new. It was just made available last week. And it goes through a number of additional pieces of information that the release notes sometimes don't have. For instance, you can see here that they go through a number of different things with images that accompany this information. Whereas if you go through and actually go into the release notes, which we open in this window here, the release notes are usually much more sparse. They're usually just kind of text-based, although I can see that this one does have some imagery in there, which is rare. But as you can see here, there are certainly new features that are being released for AIR, such as this vertex texture fetch, and this has to do with Stage 3D. So people using Stage 3D, if you ever see anything in terms of AGAL, I believe it stands for Adobe Graphics something library. I can't even quite remember. But AGAL is a very, very low-level programming language that you can use, and it uses Stage 3D. So you can do things like draw different vectors and shaders and things like that. Vertex shaders, as it says here. And it's very, very... it's very difficult. It's for people who really want to program in that stuff. I've attempted some of that, and it is something else. It's a different world, than what most people want to deal with. And that's why we have things like Starling. It's because Starling mimics the display list. Starling makes things very, very easy to use. You're using just ActionScript to tap into all of that AGAL stuff, and it's a lot simpler to use, a lot quicker to use. You don't have to just draw things out and manage buffers and stuff like that. It's kind of crazy, yeah. But Starling's great, and a lot of these frameworks, like some of the others, like Away 3D and things like that I've used, they make it really simple to throw some stuff together. And also, Starling, if you go to the forums, which I believe are under help, you can find a lot of, here they are, Starling forum. There's a lot of very active discussions on here. You can see we have discussions from just an hour ago, 2 hours ago, 5 hours ago, and so forth. And there's lots of great data on here if you're using Starling and Feathers. And speaking of Feathers, here is Feathers. So feathersui.com, and you can look at the different components involved. It's got its own SDK that you can grab, so you can download the Feathers SDK from right here. And, just integrate that into whatever IDE you might be using. Again, we've got Next-Gen ActionScript, which is a related project. They're both presented by Josh, and I'm going to butcher his last name. I'm not even going to try. Josh from Next-Gen ActionScript and Feathers. He's done great things for the AIR community, for the Apache Flex community. He's also involved in Flex. It's really, really good stuff that he's doing with Visual Studio Code, which is a really nice editor if you've ever used it for anything. It's very nice to use. And they just updated it with a bunch of stuff where they kind of brought some, what would you call it, like optional things to the surface where they've defaulted them, like file icons and things like that, that I find really, really useful. I'm a more visual person, and I like to see little icons in my files and so forth. And that's a great helper. But this is a really cool extension if you want to use something like Visual Studio Code to write your ActionScript in MXML and create things for Adobe AIR. And there's resources here, tutorials, videos, and so forth. All right. I'm going to jump into actually Adobe Animate CC, because I want to just demonstrate how simple it is to go ahead and create an application for AIR. So notice here that we can create a new AIR for desktop or AIR for Android or iOS application pretty easily right here. So if I wanted to create something for iOS, I could click on that, and it's going to create a stage for me and a timeline and all the normal stuff you would see. And if you've ever used, Flash Professional before this, it's very, very similar because Adobe Animate is Flash Professional, of course. So you can change the stage color to black, which is the first thing I kind of always do when I'm dealing with this stuff. If we go into our code snippets here, like if you're not really sure where to start, you can always look at something like this. And under Action Script, you've got a number of different things for mobile. So you've got mobile touch events and gestures and mobile actions. You've got a specific AIR for mobile category as well as an AIR category. And there's lots of neat things you can do with no matter if you're using AIR for desktop or AIR for mobile. And this will these are snippets that are full of code that you can use. One of the nice things that I really, really do like about Adobe Animate and Flash Professional is that you can do all of your design work and all of your development work in the same environment. So you can just write your code right in here. You can draw your assets in here, so forth and so on. So if I wanted to go ahead and, just draw something out here, and I'll just find a brush that looks a little more interesting than what we have right there. And let's pump that stroke up here. And, you just pretend it's a full application, right? So now if we've got our application all specced out, we can, of course, go to Control, Test, and we can test a number of different things here. We can test our AIR application in the debug launcher for desktop, if we were targeting desktop, the debug launcher for mobile, which has some additional tools around it. So what this is going to do is actually launch it on our desktop, but it's going to be launched with tools that pertain specifically to mobile, so some touch tools, geolocation tools, and things like that. Or, and this is really cool, I don't have any devices plugged into my USB right now, but if you had an iOS or Android device, depending on your platform, plugged into your computer via USB, you could actually, just push your prototype or your application in development out to your device and actually test it on a real device just by choosing this option right here. It's dead simple. I'm going to just choose in-AIR debug launcher so you can see what that looks like. So here we have my application itself in this application frame, and here is my simulator. So my simulator allows me to do things like change to emulate the accelerometer. I can emulate touch and gesture with a touch layer. So something like, let's see, zoom. So it tells you here what to do. You can place a touch point and then click another one, and it emulates two fingers spreading apart or coming together and so forth. And there's also, you can put in mock geolocation data and things of that nature. If we were using Android, we could actually go ahead and do back menu search, which Android has here as well. And when you're ready to actually publish this thing, even though it's just a couple squiggly lines, you could definitely publish it. Apple's going to reject it outright, but if you wanted to do that, you could go into your publish settings here, and you can see we're targeting AIR 25 for iOS. So this is actually the latest version of Adobe Animate. It came out about the same time that AIR 26 came out, so we don't have AIR 26 on here yet. However, if we wanted to add it, we could download it and go into Help. And from Help, we can actually go through and manage our Adobe AIR SDK. And we can see here that I've got both version 25 and version 23 installed. And we could add more right from there. So if we wanted 26, we could do that. And any of my application, my AIR for iOS settings are in here. So here's where you'd actually go through and specify certain things, including your iOS signing certificates, your provisioning profile, and all of those lovely loops that Apple makes an iOS developer jump through. Here's your different icons and so forth. So all of those options can be set from a UI right here. And when you actually go through and publish, if you do sign the application correctly, you can upload it directly to Apple's store to have it approved. And of course, I've been doing a ton of work inside of Animate lately, but you can use a lot of different things, as mentioned before: IntelliJ IDEA, Visual Studio Code, FDT, and the rest. So I'm going to kind of save the discussion for the end, because I think we will have a bit of time, because all I have right now is some wrap up in terms of resources. So some of the resources that I have that are from me to do with AIR, many of them are on lynda.com or LinkedIn Learning. It's the same content no matter where you go. And also on Pluralsight. So Pluralsight, I just released an Animate CC Building AIR Desktop Applications course. That was released, it was either early June or in May. And for Lynda, I just released an Adobe Animate CC New Features course, which touches briefly on AIR, but any of the tools inside of Animate you can of course use for AIR development. And I've got all sorts of stuff in there. If we jump back over to the browser, so inside of lynda.com, here's that new course that just came out a week ago. And there's a bunch of other courses too, including, if we go down here, if you're interested in learning ActionScript for writing AIR applications, there's a Learning ActionScript course here. And there's also a course on building mobile apps with Feathers and Starling. If you go over to Pluralsight, I've got 4 courses there. There's my new one, Building AIR Desktop Apps. I also have one on Animate CC programming, which goes into both ActionScript and JavaScript programming inside of Animate CC. And I've got app development, which of course targets AIR, and then game development, which in this case actually targets HTML5 Canvas. And here's the new course right here that is completely focused on AIR for desktop that was just released. I also have a number of books out. These aren't completely on Adobe AIR, but both of these books do definitely touch on AIR for both desktop and mobile. But they're more generalist books. One focuses on the ACAs and preparing yourself to know everything you need to pass an ACA exam and get your certification. And the other is a humongous 600-page volume that was written with Tom Green to just cover just about anything to do with Animate CC, including Adobe AIR. In closing, if anybody's going to be at MAX, I'm presenting on rich content creation for multiple platforms with Animate CC, and of course, I'm going to touch upon Adobe AIR at MAX. All right, so here's just some information, my Twitter, my email, and my web URL. However, I think it's a good time here to have a bit of discussion in terms of Adobe AIR, if there's anything that anybody wants to talk about, or any questions that you have based on the introduction that I've provided today. Fire away, and anything's game. So I see we've got a pretty good set of participants here. So, anybody want to share their own experience with Adobe AIR if you've used AIR before? I know there are a number of people here that have, and then there's probably some new people too, though I imagine we'll hit most of the new people through the recordings.